No, wait, I'll be.
All right, inevitable question. Mr. Kane, is this a good book? Because it's a really long book, and I want it to be a good book. You know my answer is going to be, of course it's a good book, because I picked it, so that's why we're reading it. Couple things. Number one, you got to stick with it. If, like I said, if you do try to read, your first reading assignment all in one night, I think you're setting yourself up for failure with that one. The way that it is set up, the prologue would be quote-unquote present day. And the book gets published in 1952. Allison starts writing it in 1946, so it's like late 40s, early 50s. But the prologue would be like current time. Chapter 1 starts a flashback. So you're dealing with a grown man in the prologue, then you're going to go back to a high school senior in chapter 1, and he's going to work his way up to a grown man, and then it's going to end in the epilogue back where we started. So essentially, it's first-person narration, but it's pretty much a flashback. This is not to be confused with H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man, which would be like the science fiction movie from the 50s or 60s, where there's like a floating fedora and sunglasses, where you have an invisible man. You do have, and your narrator tells you early on in the prologue, I'm flesh and bones and blood, just like anybody else. The issue that you're dealing with is you have a invisible man in the sense that you have a narrator who is not recognized, or he feels is not really truly seen by people, so therefore he may as well be invisible. There's certainly going to be a lot of racial issues that are going to be explored with it, because again, you're dealing with pre-civil rights era, still segregation taking place, starts in the South, moves its way up north, but it's not solely like a race issue that the book is only going to be taking a look at. But your narrator, since he's invisible, he does not have a name. So it's not going to go, hey Frank, hey Joe, Tyler, whomever. It's just the narrator. What Ellison does a good job of is he doesn't make it awkward where you feel like there should be a name and then the name's not there. But the narrator is the unnamed narrator basically throughout the whole entire book. Never at some point, like on page 469, are you going to find out what's his name. Now I know. Sean will be in the dark about it the whole entire time.
Can I give him a name?
No, you don't have that authority.
Yo, Ralph.
He just said that he picked.
Did I miss that?
Yes,
You
you
know what,
did.
Byron?
Clearly, you did.
It's a Monday.
Of the stuff that we read, I do think, and obviously biased opinion on my part here, so not subjective, but I do think it is the best, the most well-written book that we read throughout the course of the year. I think of all the writers, he's the best. He's the most talented one.
He's actually.
Ellison, and there's going to be a lot of, it's a lengthy book, so it's easier to kind of, I guess, incorporate that stuff. But it'll kind of be culminating of all the stuff that we've read throughout the course of the year, where you talk about different literary devices, whether it be illusion, juxtaposition, stuff like that. It's going to be in there. He does a lot of historical illusion stuff. Those of you in A-Push, and this doesn't mean that you're going to be better off by any means, those of you in A-Push, there's going to be a lot of carryover between what's going on in here and what's going to be going on in A-Push, especially starting like tomorrow, where you'll think that myself and Mrs. Nacarelli are trying to inundate you with the same stuff. If you're not in A-Push, don't worry about it. You'll still be fine with us going over all the backgrounds and whatnot. So you're not going to be at a distinct disadvantage or anything like that whatsoever. All right. There's a lot of light bulbs in the book.
Oh, what's on
Do you know how many light bulbs are on?
At least 10.
Lizzie knows.
6
How many?
medium light bulbs. Wait, what
How
do you
many?
mean light bulbs?
How many light bulbs?
Oh, like, like there will be like moving. I'm like, oh.
Oh, I would hope there would be for you, but I'm not so sure.
I'm like, wow. Oh, what's on the guy? What's on the guy?
This is not quoted from the book. That would be good old Chaucer.
I don't like Chaucer. I have not. I was late on my shit. Not like yeah, it's
Okay. No, that was on. He was still here. Fashion photo. Didn't see that one. There's a light bulb showing.
What's now the 359?
No one looked at this motif chart. Like taking a road trip with your grandma. Just reading all the Billboard stuff. Look at that. Just like explodes.
Invisibility. How hard do you work?
Nah. Light bulb.
That's incredible.
That'll be your prologue where you start. So you have your narrator, unnamed African American. He is basically underground. He'll give you a little explanation of it in his own little hole that he is lighting himself. So there's a photographer, Jeffrey Wall, did a series of like iconic literary stagings of scenes, and he took this one from Invisible Man, the opening, where you can see light bulbs all over the place. Now, they're not all on, which I think is part of like so he can get the photograph the way he wants. But the way that the narrator describes it at this point, and it's on your motif chart, he has 1,369 light bulbs, and they're basically on all the time. He's enveloping himself in light, and he wants to add more. So he'll talk about the ceiling, But then he goes, I want more on the walls. He wants the floor. He wants everything to be encompassed with light pretty much at all times. So certainly that whole idea of light in contrast with dark and visibility, being able to see some things, that'll be part of the motif stuff that we'll be taking a look at while we go through the book. But basically this would be the opening scene, prologue, where he'll explain some stuff to you, and then it'll go back to his days prior to this. Senior in high school is where it'll start, and then going on to college and a couple other things with it too. So for Ellison, just got a quick little timeline about some things for him. March 13th or March 1st, 1913 till 1994. Basically, part of the book is certainly meant to be allegorical, but there's some semi-autobiographical components to it as well. So the time period that you'd be looking at, you can pretty much think of an Invisible Man, the narrator, as being born early 1900s, and then he is going to college around late 20s into early 30s. Then he moves up to Harlem, much the same way as what Ellison was doing during his lifetime. But Ellison's born Oklahoma City in Oklahoma, which is still going to be considered the South. You got racism and whatnot certainly going on there. His father names him after Ralph Waldo Emerson, who we talked about back with Civil Disobedience. You recall was written by Thoreau, but Thoreau was good friends with Emerson, lived at Emerson's home. That's the place where the pond that he was living at for those couple of years outside, tutoring his children and whatnot. Emerson is, we said preeminent writer, philosopher in New England in the mid-19th century, 1800s. One of the tenets of Emerson's philosophy is going to be self-reliance and being able to take care of yourself, which is certainly going to be a thematic idea that's going to present itself within Invisible Man. Ellison has a pretty lengthy literary career, but the book that people always come back to is this one, for the most part because it's the only novel he does publish during his lifetime. Has a novel that actually comes out 5 years after he passes away. But has other writings taken place, not just that this would be his sole one. And he's not a recluse in the way that Salinger was, or avoiding public eye and all those kinds of things. For him growing up, it's just him and his mom because his father has there's an accident on a construction site that he's working at. So when Ralph Ellison is 3 years old in 1916 is when his father passes away. His mother's a domestic servant, basically a maid for a lot of families in the Oklahoma City area. She does get involved with some political movements that would be considered radical at the time. 1920s, so you're looking at socialism, communism, whatnot, where there's that Red Scare at that point. You take a look, idea of socialism, and those of you that read The Jungle are certainly familiar with it. The whole idea about equality and opportunity for everyone. So if you're part of a group that is being subjugated to racism, discrimination, segregation, disenfranchisement in some ways, then that's certainly going to be an option that people will look into. So his mother is not on an FBI most wanted list or anything like that for treason and being an anarchist, but feels that there might be something better out there for her than what the U.S. is currently providing in the 19-teens and 20s. Tuskegee Institute will be familiar to some of you. School in the South founded by Booker T. Washington. Ellison goes to Tuskegee Institute in 1933 with the hope of studying music. He has to leave in 1936 to go to New York City because he's going to try to raise more money for college, and ultimately he does not go back. So he's not going there as a writer for a literary career. He's actually hoping to become a jazz musician, and he does have some works of his do get composed and released during his lifetime. Ellison's known as a musician or writer, both for fiction and nonfiction, photographer, sculptor, so very much in the arts, has a lot of skills that he's able to utilize. But 1936, he goes to New York City. There he meets two heavyweights when it comes to writing, specifically for African American writing during the Harlem Renaissance. That's author Richard Wright and then poet Langston Hughes, who you've probably read some of his stuff before. They tell him that he should pursue a writing career, and if you're getting those two to tell you to go into writing, you probably want to listen to them and see what you can do with it. But your narrator, he never gives a name, but he goes to a college in the South that's a preeminent university, talks about the founder of the university being a highly respected man, talks about a statue, and this is going to be like chapter 2, that is outside of the college, that is a statue of the founder, and all of these things would be like historical allusions that would be connecting it back to Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee Institute. So tomorrow we're going to take a look at some stuff with Booker T. Washington and some other preeminent thinkers and political activists during the same era. But you can certainly tell as we're going through it that Ellison is heavily alluding to these events or to these places and people. So that's where you kind of get a biographical angle coming in with the book as well, besides what he's trying to do from a fictional standpoint as well. People always ask, why are there 1,369 light bulbs? Answer, I don't know. Might have transposed 1936 when he went to New York City. I don't know if that's the case, but it might be something that he thought of doing. I don't know. Could be coincidence.
Probably not.
Jake says, no, can't be, can't be.
Jake,
Can't be.
you invested a bit. That much. No, that internet was too slow.
37, you don't have to write down a story or anything like this, but 37 is when he publishes his first short story, and so from there on, really over the next 7 years is when he starts publishing a lot of articles, reviews, short stories, various publications, does some things with poetry and whatnot. Certainly social equality and justice is a big part of what he's writing about. I wouldn't consider this simply to be an example of, quote-unquote African-American literature. And certainly by the time you get to the end, he's emphasizing that this isn't just stuff that's dealing with, black and white, but just basically U.S. citizens in general, what he's looking for so far is equality and whatnot. He does have a brief stint with the Communist Party in the 1930s, but nothing really comes of it. When there was the video that we're looking at, after the Harlem, where you said, is that Atlanta? And then we said, no. There was a newspaper picture that kind of came up, and it said, join the Brotherhood at the top. In the middle part of the book, in that 10 to 15 chapter, you'll get introduced to the Brotherhood, where it never comes out and says this is a communist organization, but it certainly seems that it's meant to parallel, to kind of allude to a communist organization and whatnot. So some of that political issues facing whites and blacks will be something that he puts into the book, besides just racial things that would be happening. For Invisible Man, 46 is when he starts working on it, published in 52. This is like a very similar timeline to Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. Not meant to be same book by any means, but if you're looking for a contemporary, that would pretty much be probably the best writer that we're looking at. Mentioned to you both biographical and allegorical in a sense, where you're looking at man's place, identity within society. The fact that you have a character, a title character, narrator who doesn't really have an identity is meant to be fairly significant for us. Book starts in the South, and then he's going to move up to the North, and he'll be there by the time you get to chapter 9. So there is going to be some kind of compare and contrast with racism, alienation, those issues in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, between the North and the South. Your narrator is kind of naive at the beginning. I think he would be expecting things to be a little bit different in the North, but finds out that maybe there's a little bit more similarity than he initially thought. When book gets published in 52, it is widely acclaimed by everyone as being success. So it's not one of those books that gets unearthed 35, 40 years later and people going, hey, it might have been pretty good. Folks recognized it at the time as being very successful, whether it be 1953 Book of the Year Award, about a decade later, most important work since World War II, which would be like 20 years since then. But it's pretty much looked at as being masterpiece of American fiction for the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century. For the book, this doesn't become a huge issue for him, but it probably could have been if he had stuck around. Book gets published in 52, widely read in 53. At that point, you have McCarthyism and the Red Scare going on, where you have Senator Joseph McCarthy accusing a lot of Hollywood and literary folks as being communist sympathizers. You certainly could read it and maybe find some ways where there could be some sympathies with communism or socialism. Ellison doesn't really have to deal with being blackballed and blacklisted the way a lot of other writers and movie stars and directors and screenwriters are, because he's not really around at the time. Book gets published in 52, 53, and then for much of the 50s, he's in Europe, especially France and England for the most part, going on speaking tours and book tours and things like that. So when he comes back to the U.S. in 1958, the end of McCarthyism has already come about, but certainly if he had been around for the years earlier, could have been an issue that he has to deal with. When he does come back in 1958, he takes a teaching position at Bard College, which is in New York, and then he also works at Yale and Rutgers for a lengthy amount of time. Becomes a department chair of the English department at Rutgers in the later 60s. So if you were taking English classes at Rutgers or Yale, you could be reading Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, being taught to you by Ralph Ellison, at which point Jake could go, ooh, there's hidden meaning behind the 1,369 light bulbs, and he could say, no, you're wrong. Or go, good job. Who knows what he would do. Maybe. So some year I'll write my children's book. And we can read that in AP.
My brother just got a baby book yesterday. He's 13.
Not written by me. I think mine would be like, grow up. I was going to do Llama Llama, but someone took that idea before I did. I was really disappointed with that one.
You're a genius right there. When you think about Little Red Hen making pizza,
Should have just gone with that idea right away. I waited too long, sat on it. Llama Llama Red Pajama. Llama Llama High School Drama. I mean,
You should make a book version of The Office.
I like it.
I'd do
They're
Papa Boy.
it. Yeah.
That's just like sound bites too. Dwight Schrute.
at Addie's basketball game on Saturday, the ref looked like, what's his name? The annoying guy in the office.
White.
Couple.
Dwight, yeah. Yeah. I kept looking like that's
I love it.
looked like Dwight.
I want to be like
Should have asked for his
Maybe
autograph.
Elf on the Shelf Dwight after him.
It's another idea I should have come up with.
Elf on the Shelf. You get a lot of money.
You've all had those moments where like Google Docs crashes or the power goes out mid-essay. Ellison had a house fire that like destroyed everything that he was working on, so
Did it
You-
have, was it backed up?
was not.
Back up.
And he was working on his second novel that does get published. It's called Juneteenth. And it ultimately gets published 32 years later in 1999. But he's working on the book. He has over 300 pages of it done. And he's a meticulous writer, a lot of revisions and whatnot. So it's not that necessarily the whole thing was done, but it could have been several parts rewritten. But a lot of his manuscripts and whatnot end up getting destroyed in the fire, where you have a lot of unfinished work for him. So it's certainly possible that during his lifetime he might have published more. But at that point it kind of sets him back. Now he starts up again, continues working on it, and by the time it does get published, he has over 2,000 pages. Not meaning a 2,000-page novel, but just with revisions and whatnot, has over 2,000 pages that ultimately does get condensed into a 368-page book. But again, that's getting published after his death. So Invisible Man is the only novel that gets done during his lifetime. At the beginning of the video, I said to you, this is not coming from Invisible Man, but you had a passage. It's coming from Chaucer, Canterbury Tales. In that part, basically, it's in the opening to Canterbury Tales, where the narrator's going, I have to tell you the story, but I have to include everything in it. I can't take some parts out, no matter how unfit it might be, because if I'm going to tell you what happened, I have to tell you the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Prologue, I think you'll be okay. It'll be a little weird, because there's going to be a lot of dream sequences taking place. So in the prologue, when you're reading, if you see something in italics, it's part of his dream subconsciousness that's going on. Chapter 1 will literally be a brutal chapter, and you might have to kind of pause every now and then and take a little bit of a break from it. Chapter 2, if after you read chapter 2 you're not disturbed, you need to go back and reread chapter 2 because you missed something. So chapter 1, chapter 2 are pretty heavy chapters. It's not like that the whole way through. So it kind of punches you in the gut initially, and then it'll kind of back off a little bit, but he really goes hard and heavy early on in 1 and 2, which is part of the reason why we do the book now. If to do it in September, you're not ready. I'm not going to have you read this over the summer instead of the Grapes of Wrath, because after the second chapter, you should be going, what in the world did I sign up for, and why am I here, kind of thing. So bear with it. If you got questions about anything going on in 1 or 2, let me know, and we'll talk about it. But it's not going to be that way the whole way throughout the course of the book. All right. Chapter 2 is, I think, worse than chapter 1. There's certainly different things that are going on. Chapter 1 is essentially, it's not untouched, but chapter 1, kind of like how The Catcher in the Rye is built around a short story that Salinger does about Holden and Sally's ice skating date, Ellison writes Battle Royale as a short story in the early 1940s, and then he basically uses that to build Invisible Man around. So chapter 1, not prologue, but the first chapter, is the you hear two pronunciations, Battle Royal, Battle Royale. A Battle Royale is a basically last man standing fight. So you have a whole bunch of people, you start off in a ring, and you see who is the last one standing. That's going to be basically the impetus for the book. Starts as a short story and then builds stuff going around it. But throughout the book, dealing with chapter 1 certainly, and also chapters that are going to follow, a lot of social, intellectual issues facing African Americans, but also facing a lot of people in that post-Civil War era. So we're kind of in that Civil War in between Martin Luther King, Civil Rights Movement kind of era, where I don't want to say there's a dead period, but there's kind of a lull so far as progression for African Americans and things like that. Keep in mind that's where we're going to be. So Martin Luther King isn't really a person yet to a lot of these folks, because he's not the preeminent leader that he was at that time. So far as literary things, certainly motifs, pay attention to, because there are going to be certainly plenty of them throughout. There's also a lot of things he's going to do with imagery, allusions, metaphors, along with the imagery and also some other things. He plays around with the words white and black, especially not only in this part, but in chapter 10 when you start doing your second reading part. That'll be something we take a look at. Your first-person point of view, so it's going to be a flashback where he is basically recounting events that happened to him earlier. But if it's some kind of literary device, Allison's probably going to utilize it at some point. He's very punny in his writing, where he'll use a lot of double meaning, double entendre type stuff. His syntax will kind of change abruptly, where it's almost kind of like a musical score, where there's some rhythm and whatnot to it. So there'll be a mix of sentence varieties and stuff like that. It tends to be very lyrical in some ways. My guess would be chapter 5 will be the chapter that you have to fight through the most, just to kind of follow along with everything that's going on. So chapter 5, don't try to rush through that one. That's one where you would want to kind of take your time with it and make sure you're picking up on the elements that he's trying to get across with it. You do those things, you should be in pretty good shape. Every now and then, I think it'd be a good idea to take the motif chart out, run through those, see if you're picking up on anything. I filled it out for you for the prologue, just so you had an idea of what to keep an eye on. But pretty much most of the chapters, you should be finding at least some of those motifs, if not all of them. If you do have some chapters where they're not all present in there, of the 6, my guess is you find at least 4 of them, probably popping up throughout. Again, if you're paying attention with it. I'm not going to collect the motif chart, but as I said, I think it'd be a good idea to keep up with it. Why don't you pass in sign-out sheets so I can collect those things? So your 2 main things that you're working on at this point would be start reading Invisible Man, and then also Flannery O'Connor essay. Remember, that's Monday night of next week. Not Sunday night, essay reading.
Do you know what class reads Tuesday?
I think questioning the self, maybe.
Okay.
Sean, if you look at the syllabus online, if you scroll past,
The program-
all 4 books that are read.
Like in the program of studies, is in there. I don't know. I know they've made some changes. I know Tuesdays with Maurice is still read, but I know in Adventure Quest they read The Martian. I don't know if that was updated. Okay, they did update it. Then yeah, it should be pretty good.
Ron, you want to take the email first? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take the wiki second.
I got